Hi guys, we're going to talk about pregnancy. This is a lot of slides and a lot of dense content. We're going to get through it. I'm going to chunk this up into small videos so that you can let things marinate in your brain before moving on to the next topic. Okay, a lot of objectives here, long list. Just take a look at them. If I read the slide, we'll use up a lot of minutes that we could use talking about the actual things. But those are the things we're going to be able to accomplish. And it's a tall order, but we will do it. Prenatal development. We're going to start with that. And then we're going to take a little break and we're going to move on. So prenatal development is divided into three basic phases. The pre-embryonic stage. We start with a single cell fertilized ovum, which becomes then a clump of cells. It divides rapidly, becomes a morula, and then a blastocyst, and then it enters the uterus and implants. This stage happens in the first 14 days following conception. At this point, that fertilized egg and that rapidly dividing cluster of cells is moving through the fallopian tube, starts in the outer ampulla, the outer third of the fallopian tube, and down into the uterus. It's not considered to be susceptible to teratogens because there is no interface for those teratogens to come through and harm that embryo. There's no transfer of those agents. If something does go wrong in this phase, it's usually because of a genetic defect that was part of the inherent design of that human. Then very quickly, by day 15, all the way through week 8, we are in the embryonic stage. All organs, you see I highlighted it, it's going to be important to you. They are formed by the end of week 8, and that's why the other fact that's highlighted at the last statement is when the embryo is most susceptible to teratogens. This is when organs are, differentiating and forming their basic structure. So anything that goes wrong here could have really disastrous consequences. The fetus is also susceptible. That's, week 9 and later, but the embryo is the most susceptible. Implantation occurs by the end of week 2, usually about day 15 post-conception, and the first rudimentary structures to develop, those front runners, the heart, so vital, and the neural tube. So we said that development goes, or did we say that? Proximal, distal? We're going to say it. Proximal from the center of the neural tube outwards, and cephalocaudal from head to toe. So the neural tube is that structure that will house the brain and the spinal cord. If it fails to close, we have a neural tube defect, like spina bifida, which you will learn more about in pediatrics. So the tubular heart is the next structure, begins to beat in week 3. It starts to acquire function even in a rudimentary form. As the embryonic stage progresses, you'll see the development of chambers and valves and all of those things that make the heart function as efficiently as it does. But it starts going to work almost right away. Okay, I have here a live link to a list of teratogens, which if you click it, you will see a long list. They include things like alcohol, tobacco, infections. I think that's on the next slide. So let's go back. Yep, there it is. Teratogen is an agent that disrupts growth and development and causes anomalies. These are things that cause damage during critical periods of development. There may be a play between genetic weaknesses, those changes, little micro sequences in the DNA, and those environmental factors. So there could be an interaction. We know that some people are at higher risk for offspring with neural tube defects. Some people are at higher risk for familial heart defects. That link again to the list, but here's a much shorter list. So radiation from x-rays, alcohol, drugs, hormones. So things like those testosterone supplements when we did our contraception case studies for the transgender gentleman. Tobacco, viruses like rubella or chickenpox or parvovirus, lead, mercury, all kinds of environmental agents. So you'll see that. And when we talk about drugs, we're not just talking about illicit substances. We are also talking about medications that people might be taking. All right, here it is, the morula. a cluster of undifferentiated cells, and then suddenly the human genome starts directing these cells to differentiate into layers, the ectoderm, mesoderm. You don't need to know those for the exam, but it's kind of fascinating. The endoderm. All of those layers will become the complex and highly differentiated tissues of the body. And here it starts to develop into a more human-like form. We have a head, kind of have a tail that will regress as the, embryo develops and develops limbs. I think we see some limb buds. Yep, there's a limb bud here. There's a limb bud there. It all kind of looks like some structure that a preschooler might make out of Play-Doh. But it's also highly complex. Okay, so then we get to the fetal stage. This is weeks 9 through 38, and a lot of things happen here, but all of the organ systems are already present. They're just going to refine and mature and get more sophisticated and function more efficiently. Between weeks 9 and 12, fetal movement begins. Kidneys begin to function. They produce urine. Genitalia become fully differentiated in most embryos. Things do go wrong sometimes, but in weeks 13 through 16, female embryos will have all the eggs that they will ever have. They won't mature fully until ovulation years later, but that's good to know for other reasons. That's why women over 35 are at higher risk for chromosomal abnormalities affecting their pregnancy. The fetus will also have blood vessels that are visible under the skin. Skin's very transparent at that point, kind of reddish. Ridges will form the basis for fingerprints and toe prints. By 20 weeks, the halfway point in a typical pregnancy, the fetus can swallow amniotic fluid. Insulin production begins. That will become important when we cover pregnancy at risk, because we'll understand that interplay between the mother's glucose and the fetal insulin and how that affects neonatal health. There is the presence of lanugo, which is fine downy hairs, and vernix, which is a cheesy substance. They cover the body to protect that fetus from amniotic fluid. By the 24th week, the lungs begin to form something called surfactant. Surfactant makes the lower airways slippery so that they can expand and increase their surface area for gas exchange. But surfactant production doesn't become sufficient until about term. So preterm babies may need to have surfactant administered to them. All of these concepts are going to become important at some other point in this course. I just want you to understand that we're building a structure here. Viability refers to the ability of a fetus to survive outside the uterus. Currently, one of the reasons I re-recorded this presentation, the age has changed from 24 to 23 to 22 weeks, the very earliest. It may go further back still. It's important to know that the risk to an infant born that extremely preterm is high. We will cover that in our last class in this course. But viability is an important concept to understand. And there is a fetus in the second trimester, early in the second trimester at about 13 weeks. And you can kind of see now, instead of limb buds and rudimentary structures, we have an actual face, actual arms, fingers, toes, genitalia. So let's talk about the third trimester. By the 28th week, in most male fetuses, the testes will descend. Sometimes not, and that's why we assess for it in the newborn period, but the fetus usually also moves down to a head first position to facilitate birth. Blood starts to be produced in the bone marrow. So this fetus is becoming more typical of extrauterine life, more adaptable to extrauterine life. Weeks 29 through 34, subcutaneous fat begins to be deposited. It will continue to do so throughout the remainder of pregnancy. The fetal heart rate variability is more pronounced. That is a concept we will talk about when we talk about fetal monitoring because of central nervous system maturity. In weeks 30 to 38, fetus starts to be able to see. Vernix caseosa is visible in skin creases, so it starts to fade and diminish, but it's still present in the creases. And lanugo might be found, but only usually on the back and shoulders. It starts to decrease as the infant or the fetal skin thickens and becomes more able to withstand being immersed in amniotic fluid. The lungs and central nervous system mature, and they continue to mature all the way to 40 weeks while the fetus continues to grow and gain weight. That's why they have the campaign for Go the Full 40. Okay, lastly, for this video, we're going to talk about the placenta and the umbilical cord. The placenta is a circulatory interface. It is an amazing organ. It is the only organ that in the normal human population is shared by two people, the mother and the embryo or fetus. And the blood doesn't mix. All of the exchanges that happen in a space called the intervillous space. The placenta forms and attaches with little finger-like projections like an alien life form known as chorionic villi, where the blastocyst implants. It serves three primary functions: to circulate blood between mother and fetus, to protect the fetus from substances that could cross that barrier. Although, to be honest, it is not a magic barrier. Many things do get through. That's why we talked about teratogens. And it also secretes hormones that support the pregnancy. Estriol is a form of estrogen, and it's responsible for a lot of the development of the organs and structures that the pregnant person needs. HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, which initially is secreted by the ovum and then the placenta takes over, and those levels increase until they plateau in pregnancy. And progesterone, which relaxes smooth muscle, helps support the developing fetus and keeps it from being expelled by contractions of the uterus. And all of this is, done by this temporary organ that's shared between two people. The biggest takeaway you need to know is that the placenta is the center of gas exchange. It is the fetal lungs for the time being. They don't breathe air. All of the oxygenation they get. So anything that compromises a placenta can lead to hypoxia and respiratory acidosis in the fetus. And there it is, so beautiful. They call it the tree of life. So there's the trunk and there are the branches. The smooth side is the fetal side. When it comes out and in delivery, we call it shiny Schultz. And we like when it comes out with the fetal side outside. The maternal side is messier, it's bloodier. We call it dirty Duncan, if that's what presents to us after delivery. And then we kind of have to examine it to make sure it all came out, and that'll be important to you later. But you can see, the complexity of this organ. It's very, very vascular. There's a lot of blood volume that goes through this placenta every single second. It's amazing. Umbilical cord. We know what an umbilical cord is. It arises from the fetal side of the placenta, and it serves as a conduit for blood traveling to and from the embryo and fetus to the mom and vice versa. It contains one large vein. So remember this, AVA, AVA. One vein, two arteries. The vein is kind of this large floppy thing, and you would think that that's how the deoxygenated blood goes back to mom. No, not so. It goes from mother to fetus. Okay, the vein carries the oxygenated blood to the placenta, where the oxygen is then floating in the intervillous space, and then it's picked up by the fetus. There are two little arteries. They look really tiny and round. Kind of looks like two eyeballs and a smiley face. They carry deoxygenated blood back to the placenta so that mom can pick it up then and dispose of the waste. The umbilical cord is covered in Wharton's jelly, and that kind of supports and cushions those little vessels so that they don't get compressed. It's like stepping on the baby's lungs if it does. And it often appears kind of kinked or twisted, like spirally, because babies move. They like to play jump rope with their cords. Okay, we're going to stop there and pick it up in a little bit.